Well, welcome back everyone. This afternoon I'm going to spend some time moving back in time from this morning's exploration of music from mostly the early 17th century. I'm going back into the 16th century and looking at two particular collections of music that may or may not be for viols. I'll explain that as we go along. We're all well aware, I think, that the consort of viols developed in this country in the first part of the 16th century. The earliest references to players at the early Tudor court of Henry VII and then Henry VIII, and particularly the influx of Italian players in 1540 to Henry VIII's court. And we have plenty of evidence of ownership and making of instruments throughout the latter part of the 16th century. The details are mostly in the book that Michael and I found references to ownership of viols in all sorts of unlikely places. Further and further from the court itself, the old assumption was that the viol consort started at court and then spread out through the stately homes and into lower echelons of society. I think Michael sort of questioned that, and said that there were many layers of society playing viols that were not directly connected to the court at all. The evidence we have for viol consorts in England come towards the end of Elizabeth's reign. The earliest and more or less only pictorial example of a consort of viols playing is the Henry Unton funeral portrait, shortly after 1596. That's the only picture that survives anywhere of an English consort of viols in the Elizabethan period. And shortly after the first publication, Holborn's pavans, etc., in 5 parts for viols, violins, or other musical wind instruments, in other words, almost whatever you want to play it on. But viols come first. By the 1590s, the viols were well established as one of the main playing ensembles of music around this country, not just in the highest echelons. But we have very little evidence of what music they played. There's very little specifically for viols until into the 17th century. So my task this afternoon is to persuade you that some of the music in these manuscripts that survive from earlier in the Elizabethan period may well have been the sort of music that viol players enjoyed playing. The two that I'm going to be looking at, one is in the British Library, manuscript 31390, which I'll just call as the table book, because it's formatted in a way that you sit round the table to play it, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then secondly, John Baldwin's Commonplace book, which is not music to be performed from directly because it's in score and you couldn't sit round with 5 or 6 viols and play from it. It's too small. It's a resource, a repository from which parts might have been written separately. So let's begin with the table book. If you've not seen facsimiles of this, you may wonder how it works. This is a 6-part piece. This is John Taverner's Quaimad Modum, and the 6 parts are written so that you can sit on 6 different faces of the book in order to read it. So you've got one part reading that part, one reading that part, one reading this part, 2 reading upwards, and the 6th part reading that part. Very convenient. You put it on a table, 6 players can sit around it, and it is just about big enough to play from, particularly if you know the music quite well. So it may well largely be an aid memoir to play, rather than something that you sight read your way through. The 6-part music is in some ways more complicated than the 5-part music, because it takes up more space and you're going to be colliding with each other. Interestingly, this particular piece, John Taverner's Quaimad Modum, there's only one other copy of it, and that's also in a copy by Baldwin, not in the book I'm talking about, but in his set of part books, of which one part is missing in Christchurch Library. And I'm quite interested that Paul Doe, when editing this music for the Musica Britannica Elizabethan Consort Music volume, his comment on this piece is, the tessitura is too low to produce a satisfactory effect on any ensemble, even viols. Because they're all in fairly low clefs, and it does sit pretty low. It would take tenors and basses to sing it. There's no text, and it doesn't appear anywhere else with a text. So it seems, if it was ever sung, that's not been recorded. Hopefully, when we recorded it with the Rose Consort a few years ago, we've proven that it was possible and perfectly satisfactory to play it on a set of viols, Parce Bordeaux. Table book format is something that's relatively rare, sitting round, but has quite a long ancestry. The earliest known example dates from 1538, and this is a collection of French songs published by Moderne in Lyon in 1538. Here's a 4-part song by Sandra, Je ne le crois. And again, you've got superius and bassus facing one way, and altus and tenor facing the other way. So the 4 parts, you put it on the table, 2 sit one side, 2 sit the other side, and off you go. Just in passing, Je ne le crois. The first piece we're going to play tonight in our concert is by Thomas Tallis. It's taken from the table book, and the little title at the end of it is Je ne l'y crois. It's got absolutely nothing to do with that piece. Whether the copyist of the table book thought it was a French chanson or thought Tallis might have set a French poem, I have no idea. It's a real odd mismatch. He's assisted by Tallis, a composer who, as far as I know, never set any French text, but he gives it a little French title. Was he somehow getting modelled up with a piece that he knew? I don't know, but there's no musical contact between those 2 pieces. What table book format for performance is quite interesting in is how you sit. This is something that Richard Raskell wrote about in a couple of early music articles several years ago, and these examples are taken from his book, which just diagrammatically shows where the players sit. So in a 6-part piece, like the one you've just seen, the top part is there, next to the bass part, 1 and 6, highest and lowest parts, side by side at one side of the table. 5 is here, diametrically opposed to 6. 2 is there, diametrically opposed to 1, diagonally across. And 3 and 4 are on the 2 long sides. When you open it, it's about that wide. It's a bit deeper, it's about 2 centimetres deeper than that. But that's the sort of size of book you're looking at. So you imagine putting it down, and you're as near as you can get with your bass viol without hitting the table, and you're reading from one side here. But the crucial thing that we take from this layout is that voices that are close in pitch are distant in space in the performance. So 1 and 2, the 2 highest parts are opposite. 5 and 6 are as far opposite as possible. Now, mostly when you play on consorts and viols, I wonder how many of you normally sit in sort of string quartet format. First treble, second treble, first tenor, second tenor, bass, second bass, and go around in order in a sort of orchestral layout. Richard's point is that if you were playing from this particular set of pieces, you wouldn't do that. You'd be all mixed up. And he makes the point, which is quite an interesting one, I think, that in polyphony, where one voice enters on the same note that somebody else is already playing, it's quite hard to hear if they're next together, but if they're at the opposite ends of the opposite sides of the circle, it's much easier to hear the counterpoint, a point being moved from one place to another, literally in space. So there are implications. There are even more implications if you want to sit like that, but then are in a concert situation where you want to open the circle to an audience. Where do you split the circle? We were thinking about that for our concert tonight, and we've decided that we're going to do it in the round here. There are seats either side as well as in front. We won't be completely in the round, so we can sit in table formation. When you've got 5 players, which we have tonight, it's slightly more complicated because 1 has a whole side to themselves, reads across. 2 has a whole side to themselves, opposite, 1 and 2 opposite still. 5 is next to 1, as 6 was next to 1 but is on the side. 4, the nearest in pitch to 5, is opposite. 3 takes up the middle, reading in the same direction as 2. So it either has to be 2 and 3, or 3 and 2, And you hope that number 3's got better eyesight and can see up at the top of the page across the table. So we've gone for a sort of format like that. And if we were to open it out, we'd probably keep the base somewhere in the middle and open it out there. So 4 would be over there and 2 would be over here. But it's quite interesting in that we so often assume that the 2 trebles work together or the 2 tenors work together, and they often don't in this sort of music. In Elizabethan consort repertoire, they're often very individual, and you probably hear it better if they're not together. What do we know about this manuscript, this table book? Where did it come from? Unfortunately, very little. There's been quite a lot of speculation about its history, and we don't even know who copied it. One of the things I'll be doing is comparing and contrasting these 2 collections, and the one we definitely know who copied it, John Baldwin. This one we don't. It has a title page. In fact, it has 2 title pages, one at each end. Because if you think about it, a table book doesn't have a front and a back, does it? So that might be the front, and that might be the back, or that might be the front, and that might be the back. So the title page is reproduced at either end, and it's the same writing but in a slightly different layout. And it's described as a book of in nomines and other solfaing songs of 5, 6, 7 and 8 parts for voices or instruments. Almost certainly this was written after the collection had been completed. It's thought this is of a later date. There are 1 or 2 additions to the manuscript that come somewhat later than the bulk of it. And it may be that at that point the title page was written thinking that the thing was now complete. There's only 1 8-part piece in the collection, and that comes at the moment right at one end of it. And that's a bird motet, 2-part motet in 8 parts. So maybe the title, when the copy is copied out the 8-part piece, you thought, right, that's enough. I'll do a title page at that point. There are in fact 1 or 2 4-part pieces which don't get mentioned in the title page. The 2 curiosities about this. One is this Latin motto, Veris et non homo. I am a worm and not a man. Biblical quotation. And some commentators have said, well, what's that doing there? What does it imply? Maybe it implies that the owner was someone called Mr. Worm, or Wormold, or some other worm-related name. And so this is their way of putting, this is my book. I don't know, that seems slightly far-fetched to me. I can't see any relevance of that to anything else. It must have meant something to the person that wrote it, and if anyone's got any ideas, I'd be delighted to hear them. The other interesting thing is that on what's now at the back of the book, the way it's bound and paginated now, at the back of the book, this end has a signature, B. Gates, 1728. Who was B. Gates? He must have owned it and must have had access to it at some point in the 18th century, 150 years probably after it was copied. He's quite an interesting character. He was a singer, a bass singer, who was a chorister at the Chapel Royal as a boy, and then went on to become a gentleman of the Chapel Royal, sang at Westminster Abbey, sang one of the bass solos in the first performance of Handel's Detting Te Deum. So at the forefront of music making in London in the 1720s, 30s, 40s. And he owned this book. He wrote his name on it. Which is interesting because he was one of the founder members of one of the very earliest early music societies. The Academy of Vocal Music, which turned itself after a few years into the Academy of Ancient Music, whose purpose in life was to keep alive old music. You know, we tend to think of ourselves as the first early music generation, you know, those of us that go back to the 60s and 70s. We vaguely remember that there were dolmetschers and there were people in the 19th century beginning to be interested in it. But back here in the 18th century, there's a society dedicated to old music. They also played contemporary music. They played a lot of Handel, but they were also interested in early pieces. There are records of what they performed at their weekly meetings. They met on Friday evenings fortnightly in a local pub off the Strand, and used to sing together. And it was when it was formulated, it was only members of the Chapel Royal Choir, St Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey. They were the only people allowed to join it, apart from some wealthy patrons in the nobility, who presumably kept it all going financially. And gradually it expanded, and people like Pepusch directed the musical choices of what was going to happen. The very first meeting in 1726, so 2 years before this sign was made, included madrigals by Maurencio, a Morley motet, madrigals by Stradella, Stefani, and so on. So vocal music of not as old as the music in 31390, but it would be really interesting to know whether Gates took this along to one of those meetings and said, hey, look at this, here's some early English music, why don't we do some of this? Of course, as singers, they'd have had to have made up their own words, because there are no words in 31390, or they could have sung it to solfa syllables. There's a rather nice quotation here. In 1734, so just a few years after that signature was put, there's a slightly snide reference to that indefatigable society, the gropers into ancient music, the hummers of madrigals. So some contemporary thought this was all a bit non-new, this early music stuff, but nevertheless they did it, and they met regularly for a number of years. And there were connections with viols even at this stage. Peter's book on life after death, the life of the viol after its main period of activity, has a reference to a bass viol made by Henry J. in Southwark 1613 and a case kept to it, which was at London in Albemarle Street, owned by James Bridges, the Earl of Carnarvon, Duke of Chandos, who of course was the patron of Handel's and Pepusch writing music for Chandos, and also was one of the patrons of the Academy of Ancient Music. So maybe Bridges took along his bass viol to one of these meetings and said, well, can I join in playing my Henry J? There are connections. I'm spinning a story, aren't I? But there are tangible connections between this manuscript, viols, and an interest in early music. One of the things about the two-way reading of the book, front and back, that Warwick Edwards pointed out in his PhD back in the 1970s, was that there are several items in the book that would suggest that actually the current back was the front, which might be why he wrote his name on that side rather than that side. For instance, there are motets with two parts, and as it's foliated at the moment, part 2 comes before part 1. And there's things like the what's the Parsons piece? Oh yes, de la Cour, the Fantasy de la Cour. The first part appears after the second part in the manuscript, as you would read it starting from the front now. So there are several implications that actually it's all been done the wrong way around, that the back was originally the front, and so on. Let's have a look at what its connections with Chichester might be. One of the reasons I decided to talk about this was because we were here today. I've seen later connections with London, but in the 16th century there are several possible connections with where we are now. First of all, there's a possibility that it was copied by Clement Woodcock, who was organist at the cathedral here 1570 onwards till 1590. That is disputed, and I'll explain that in a moment. But there are various reasons for this. There's 3 examples in the manuscript where someone has annotated, you probably can't quite see this, but at the end of a piece by Mundi, W, 1578. W, Woodcock, or Worm, or somebody else beginning with W. But the date is there, 1578, and that occurs 2 or 3 times. This may well be someone checking the manuscript against other parts or against another source and saying, yes, it's okay, and I'll sign it off, 1578. But who or what is the W is a bit of a mystery. Warwick Edwards thought it was Clement Woodcock, and he says one of the reasons for thinking about that is that there are 4 pieces in this manuscript by Woodcock which only exist in this source. And Woodcock was in Chichester, therefore the manuscript might have had a Chichester connection. Also, the name of the composer in those Woodcock pieces has the Christian name, Clement Woodcock. All the others, it's Mr. this or Dr. that, Dr. Ty, Mr. Tallis, etc. The only person that gets a Christian name is Clement himself, which I think is quite significant. I mean, you probably wouldn't call yourself Mr. Bryan, whereas you might call yourself John Bryan and put your name in full. The reason that it's been disputed is to do with writing. Here's that example, Clement Woodcock, written in the manuscript on one of his pieces. The person that's done most of the work on Woodcock's life was Robert Ford, who published in Calis 16, 1978, an article concerning Woodcock's appointment at Canterbury Cathedral, where he was before he came to Chichester. And he's been through all the records that survive. He says there are 9 signatures by Woodcock, and this is one of them from Canterbury manuscripts, from payment records and so on. And Ford says he conceived no connection between the writing of this signature and that writing. Now, I'm no paleographer, but it seems to be they're not a million miles apart, compared with some of the other signatures that he compares with in the Canterbury manuscripts that are nothing like either of those. There are some fairly distinct things like the formation of the D and so on. So I'm not quite sure why Ford dismissed out of hand the fact that the person that wrote that couldn't be the person that wrote that. If any of you want to come and have a closer look afterwards, I mean, Michael, you've done a lot of work on 16th century hands, and you might be able to confirm or deny. Yes, Ford's comment is the Canterbury signatures can in no way be reconciled with any of the writing in the table book. That seems a bit of an extreme reaction to me. Now, the other bit of W-ness in this volume is this little document here that appears on the bottom of one leaf towards the end, or the current end of the manuscript, which is signed by another W, William Whalley, W-H-A-L-L-E-Y. And it's a petition to the Dean and Chapter of Chichester, requesting that the Vicarage of Pagham, which we heard about this morning, Pagham Church, be not granted to anyone else but himself. And this was dated 1596, so it's 20 years on from the 1578 date there. Whalley was the vicar of Sidlesham, which is south of Chichester, and died in 1625, and his will was proved here in Chichester. So how did Whalley's writing get into 31390? Possibly through one Edward Bragg, who was the recipient of a grant of administration left by Woodcock. Woodcock, on his death, awarded things to Edward Bragg, who was the vicar of Sidlesham, Whalley's predecessor. So did Woodcock copy the manuscript, give it to Bragg, and Bragg gave it to Whalley, who used a bit of paper out of it to write this plea. Who knows? It's all a bit obscure. But the interesting thing is how many of these connections are very close to us here. Here we are in Chichester. Right at the end of his life, Clement Woodcock got ordained and was given the living of Rombleswyk, which is just here now, sort of assumed into Chichester itself. In fact, Pagham is down here on the coast by the harbour. Sidlesham is there where Whalley was the vicar. So they're all in close proximity. This manuscript must have been in Chichester in those late 1500s, early 1600s. And for me, that helps me think that maybe Woodcock had a closer involvement with it than Ford thought. Now, let's get into what it contains. It's difficult. You'll read in various books and articles about this manuscript how many pieces it contains, and they'll come up with a different number because some people count 2 halves of a motet as 2 separate pieces and some don't, and so on. It's about 135 pieces, mostly in 5 parts, a fair number in 6, a couple in 4, 2 7-part pieces. Can anyone guess what those might be? It's a book of in nominés. Parsons, the 2 Parsons in nominés. 1 or 2 in 8 parts, that's the 2 halves of the bird motet, and 1 in 12 parts, in which the 6 parts of the book are each divided into 2. So you're really going to have good eyesight to read that. That's apparently a motet which has lost its text by Edward Blanks. You may know the 5-part fantasy by Blanks, which interestingly is also in this manuscript, and it's the only piece called a fancy. Its title is Fancy by Blanks, and there are no other pieces called fantasy. In fact, the idea of a fantasia for viols, which we're also familiar with, largely post-dates the Elizabethan period. It's really when you get into the Jacobean period that people start talking about fancies for the viols. None of these pieces in this table book has a text. Many of them have a title, just an incipit, which may be an English anthem, it may be a Latin motet, it may be a named in nomine. There are 42 in nomines, quite a large number. 33 secular songs, 32 sacred pieces, so an equal balance between sacred and secular appearing pieces. From other sources we can say that yes, this was a motet, yes, this was a chanson, or whatever, but all we have in this particular manuscript is its title. There are 36 named composers, the most prolific of which is Thai. It's the main source for many of Thai's in nomines, particularly the ones with titles, and it's been speculated that perhaps the reason they were given titles was the copyist of this manuscript trying to make sure that he knew which one was which. One is called Round, and one is called Report, and one is Rachel's Weeping, and one is Weep No More, Rachel, which again come in the wrong order in the book. If you read it from the front, Weep No More comes before Rachel Weeping. So that's another example of why it should be read from the back. There are 18 by Philip van Wilder, very influential composer at the early Tudor court, who came from the Low Countries and acted in effect as master of the King's music. The post didn't exist in his time, but had a group of musicians that did chamber music in the royal establishment. Singers, harp players, luthists. Distinct group of players from the Chapel Royal and other musicians in the court. Tallis, there are 6, Parsons 6, Mundy 5, Woodcock 4, and then isolated examples by many others. What I find interesting is that there's a very large number of pieces that were originally French texted, chansons by French composers or from the Low Countries. Philip van Wilder, most amongst them, Derek Ferrada, who worked for Arundel, and wrote a fair amount of music that survived. Well-known composers like Arcadelt, Clement Woodcock, Créquillon, Gamba, etc., and through to slightly more recent ones like Lassos. The copyist made several mistakes in identifying who composers were. There are some misattributed to other composers, which I'll mention in a moment, but also I quite like the one piece by Jean Maillard, French composer, who was based in Paris all his life, as far as we know, who the copyist of 31392 says, Mr. Maillard, an Italian. So, you know, something went wrong in translation there. They range in date from John Taverner, inevitably the nominate, as well as Quaimo Modem, as I showed you earlier, through to, so that's probably written in the 1520s, through to composers like Lassos and even Bird, music written in the 1560s, 1570s. So it's got a 50-year span of chronologically of its contents, quite wide-ranging. It does go slightly later for a couple of later pieces that were added almost certainly by a different hand. There are other examples of misattribution too. There's a lovely song we'll play tonight, Triste Départ, attributed here to Mr. Phillips, I. Philip van Wilder, but was actually published by Gamba or Homlet, depending on where you come from, in 1544. So whether it was the copyist of 31390 that got it wrong, or whether the source he was working from had already misattributed it to the wrong composer, we'll never know. But it's quite interesting that subsequent research has shown that quite a lot of the attributions aren't in fact quite correct. It's largely a very good copy. There are some errors in the copying, and this is one of the things that undermines the Woodcock connection, because one of the pieces in the book is Woodcock's 5-part Browning, and in 31390 it's riddled with mistakes. So if Woodcock was copying it, would he have copied it and not checked that he'd written the right thing down? There's a much better copy in the Dow part books, which many will be familiar with through the facsimiles. There are later pieces, such as the Bird Browning, which you see there, and some commenters say this is a different hand. I'm not sure it is. I think it's just a much more compressed hand because there's a lot more notes to fit onto the page. And it looks very dense because there's so much fast music to fit into that. But that's there. It's possibly a later edition, or one of the last additions to the piece, the book. And then this one, which is clearly in a completely different hand. This is a madrigal by Giovanni Croce, which wasn't published till 1590 and has nothing very much to do with the rest of the book. It's 10, 20 years later than most of the other music in the book, and has one or two more interesting, it's got bits of text, just the beginnings of sections with an incipit, so that it would be more easy to fit a text to that than to most of the other ones. One of the things that I find really interesting about the pieces in 31390 that are also in other sources is that they're very often adapted, they're expanded, they're arranged, if you like. An obvious example is the Taverner 4-part in Nomine, which in this manuscript has 5 parts. Those of you that can see the screen, can you work out which is the new part? Line 4, which is different from all the others. It doesn't partake in the opening point of imitation. It starts with a rising minor third and then falls much more rapidly in a more florid sort of line. And then begins little triadic things to fit in with the harmony that's going around. It's got the fastest note values. There are no, or very few crotchets anywhere else. But this added 4th part that only appears in this manuscript, I think brings it up to date. Here's a 1520-ish piece, brought up to the 1560s, 1570s, by making it into a 5-part piece and by having something more florid weaving its way through what appears to be rather sparse, I think rather beautifully sparse, texture of the original. Very interesting that there are several pieces in this manuscript that are adaptations. Here's one of the chansons, madrigals, or the Italian madrigals, Si grande la pietà. This was published in 1539. It's Jacques Arcadelt in his first book of madrigals, a book of madrigals that was very important in spreading the madrigalian word through Europe. It includes things like Il Bianco Cigno and so on, that became sort of all over Europe hits. But the copies, so there's the title page, there's the superiors part. You probably can't read this, it's a bit faint now, but the original 4 parts. And then in 31390 it's a 6-part piece. 2 parts added. Interestingly, either side of the original, there's a higher top part, like a descant over the top, and an extra basso that fills out harmony and takes us well down in range below Arcadelt's bass part. And in order to fit those 2 in, and to make them take part in the counterpoint, he has to cut and chop and paste the original. So you get the opening 4 voices coming in, identically to what was printed in 1539. And then when he wants to bring in his new bass part, he has to change the harmony and put rests in the original parts to be able to do it. So he's sort of literally expanding it that way in order to make room for these 2 new parts coming in. and it turns it into a completely new piece in a rather clever, but slightly strange way. Why not just write your own 6-part piece? But he's taken this piece and adapted it. It's part of that whole tradition of 16th and 17th century music of imitatio, of taking an original and paying homage to it by expanding it in some way. And there's a 5-part elaboration of a 4-part chanson. This is Fraise Gaillard by Clement Woodcock, published in 1545, 4 parts. In the table book, it has a slightly mangled title. It's Fraise Gaillard. There's nothing Gaillardish about it at all. And there is an added part, but unlike the previous one, where the 4 original parts started and then parts 5 and 6 were added around it, this completely takes apart the original and uses elements of it in different places. So the original starts at quite a long point before the other voices come in. Bom, 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 bim, bom, la, 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 dee, 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 and then voices 3 and 1 come in above it. In 3-1-3-9-0, bom, 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 bim, he cuts straight in with the counterpoint above it. And although that goes off at like the beginning of that part, it very soon changes into something else to make room for the other parts. So as a source for understanding how English composers adapted continental pieces and made them suitable for their 5-part ensembles, it's a really interesting manuscript. Just seeing how original material was used. It's not just copies of other people's music, but very often adaptations. So, what does this manuscript tell us? What is it? What's it for? First of all, it's a snapshot. It's just a collection of one person's musical tastes at a particular time. This copyist, whether it was Woodcock or Worm or somebody else beginning with W, it collects music from a 50-year period from all over Europe and England. The mix of English and continental pieces, I think, is significant. And I'll say something right at the end about that. It's the unique source for many pieces. We wouldn't have many of the pieces that we enjoy playing without this source, because they just don't survive anywhere else. And it's the only complete source for some of the others. So, for instance, pieces that appear in Baldwin's part books, of which the tenor part book has gone missing, can be completed by comparing them with 31390. What was it for? Some people have thought it might be for teaching choristers. If Woodcock was at Chichester Cathedral as master of the choristers, one of his jobs would be to teach the boys. And it's often been thought that innomines were a good way of teaching choir boys how to write counterpoint. You have a cantus firmus and you elaborate it in it with a descant part and then adding other parts to it. And that's aided by this little chart of mensuration signs right at the end of 31390. Just tells you what tempus perfectus means and so on, how it divides up. I don't think that's the case, actually. I'm pretty sure that this music is not particularly for teaching purposes. It may have been used for that, but I think it's more for performance, not in a liturgical setting, but in some sort of domestic setting where 6 folk can sit around the book and play it or sing it. Remember the title page for solfaing songs for voices or instruments. So it's not because it has no text doesn't mean it's instrumental. You could sing it to the syllables of the hexachord. And it may well have been designed for choir boys to practice that. I don't think it was for teaching. I think it was really a playlist. It was his Spotify playlist of pieces that he liked, just brought together. And we'll see that a very similar thing happening with my second manuscript. The Baldwin Commonplace book and the 31390 table book have a lot in common in terms of what sort of music they collect. But they're very different in other points of view. And the most significant difference from a modern researcher's point of view is that we know who wrote this one. And we know quite a lot about John Baldwin himself. Born sometime just before 1560, the first reference to him is as a lay clerk tenor at St George's Chapel, Windsor. That's quoted in an article published in Music and Letters in 1952, and subsequently nobody's been able to find that reference in any of the original sources. So I'm not quite sure where the writer of that article found it from, but you'll see it in most of the biographies of Baldwin. Yes, he was appointed in 1575 as a choirman at St George's, Windsor, shown below. He was a copyist and was paid for copying music for St George's Chapel. He was quite well known, not only as a copyist, but as a musician and possibly composer. In 1591, the great entertainment of Queen Elizabeth at Elbetham, there was a piece performed below her window in the morning, in the merry month of May. A three-part song which appears in the Baldwin Commonplace book as John Baldwin's own composition. It's possible that he wrote this piece and it was performed for the Queen in 1591. Somehow he came to royal notice because in 1594 the Lord Chamberlain wrote to the Sub-Dean of the Chapel Royal that John Baldwin of the College of Windsor should be placed next in ordinary in Her Majesty's Chapel. In other words, he'd been earmarked for a job coming up in the Chapel Royal. He had to bide his time. He was appointed in 1595 as gentleman in ordinary. That was an unpaid post. He wasn't a full gentleman, but would go along as a supernumerary and maybe debt. Until a tenor's place be void, you had to wait for someone to die before you got a job in the Chapel Royal. Someone conveniently called Robert Tallentire did die in 1598, and Baldwin became a full member of the Chapel Royal, where his colleagues would include William Byrd, of course. There's a nice reference to Baldwin travelling to Exeter Cathedral in 1600, where the accounts of the College of Vicars Choral at Exeter has a receipt for payment of 3 shillings for half a salmon, a leg of mutton with wine and sugar, when Mr. Baldwin and his brother with Mr. Stone and others were at our hall to dinner. So a travelling convention from St George's, Windsor, going to Exeter and having a jolly at the Exeter Cathedral expenses. Baldwin sang at the funeral of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603 and also at James I's coronation, sang again in 1612 at Henry, Prince of Wales's funeral, and died himself in 1615, buried in Southwark. Rather sadly, he left a young wife who was pregnant at his death and gave birth to a son 3 months after he died, also christened John. So quite an eventful life in the highest areas of English music making around the Chapel Royal and in London. Quite unlike Clement Woodcock, who seems to have been a parochial choir master working at well, you can hardly call Canterbury parochial, can you? But not in London, Canterbury and then Chichester. Baldwin as a copyist we know a lot about, and many of his copied pieces and manuscripts survive. The books I've been mentioning already, the so-called Baldwin Park books in Christchurch now, of which the tenor part's missing, copied probably between about 1575 and 1581, contains very similar music to the 31390 and also the Commonplace book that I'm talking about this afternoon, which post-dates it slightly. Many of the entries in the Commonplace book are dated by Baldwin, copied by me, John Baldwin, June the 3rd, 1594. Meticulously put in place. And so there are dates ranging from 1581 to 1606. So he's going through his career keeping this book. The Commonplace book is usually associated with words rather than music. Commonplace books were collections of useful things, an anthology of recipes, of wise sayings, extracts from poems and things that you wanted to keep. It's just your private library, your private little collection of things. And in Baldwin's case here, it's his private collection of music that he liked. Most famously, he copied in 1591 My Lady Neville's book, all music by William Byrd, supervised by Byrd. Byrd and Baldwin lived not far apart on the outskirts of Windsor and Middlesex. And his hand is extremely clear and very beautiful. The 6-line stave, as was mentioned earlier this morning, for keyboard writing. He also writes, he has the so-called Forest Heather Park books of rather earlier liturgical English church music, comes through him at some point, and he adds substantial number of pieces to that. He's copying from earlier part books into it. And he also adds a couple of pieces to the Dow books that many of you will be familiar with, also now in Christchurch, copied by Robert Dow at All Souls. Oh, you really can't see this, I'm afraid, but this is a pair of folios from the Dow books, side by side. That's in Dow's hand, that's in Baldwin's hand, and what he's added here is a piece by Nathaniel Giles, a motet. Giles was his boss at Windsor. Giles was the organist at Windsor when he was a singing man there. And it's quite likely that the Dow books came from Oxford with the new dean of St George's Windsor, who'd been Robert Dow's colleague in Oxford, and then moved to Windsor, probably took the Dow books he'd been left them or he got hold of them, and said to Baldwin, can you add a couple of pieces by my composers here? So there's Giles is there, and there's one or two others added to it. So he's quite prolific as a copyist. And in this particular book, the Commonplace book, which is smaller than the table book, it's sort of a more or less A4 size, with a bit missing, so it's each folio is about that size. Not something you'd want to sit round and play from in scores of 6-part music. It's mostly written in score format, so probably either an organ book, as we saw this morning, the scores we use as organ books, or for study purposes, or just a repository. It's just a way of collecting pieces that Baldwin wanted to keep safe. There are some 209 pieces in this, mostly in score, and then towards the end of the manuscript he moves into what we call choir book format, where the separate parts are distributed across the opening. So you get the superiors at the top, tenor below it, altus here and bassus there. Which it's much easier to perform from. You just get 4 guys to stand round, and you're all facing the same way, put it on a choir stand, and 4 of you can sing from it, reading your individual part. Mostly in 5 parts, and interestingly, it's not all old music. A lot of it is. Some of it goes right back to earlier than anything in 31390, as I'll show you in a moment, but includes modern music like Maurencio madrigals. He collects 13 Maurencio madrigals. We'll look at that on another slide in a moment. Towards the end, he goes into smaller scale things. Most of the early part of the book is 5 or 6 part material in score, and then towards the end he starts writing a lot of 3, 4 and 2 part pieces in choir book format. These include things like Bird's 3-part mass, and interestingly, the reduced sections of many of the big lavish liturgical pieces from the beginning of the 16th century, things like taverner masses and votive antiphons and so on, which are often in 6 parts, but have sections which is 3 voices, and he picks out the 3 voice parts and just keeps them. Maybe because he didn't have 6 people to perform with, it was something he could do with a couple of people and himself, or that he was particularly interested in the counterpoint. Baldwin was fascinated by complexity. I think that's one of the reasons he collected Maurencio. Maurencio was new and weird. He was an avant-garde composer, if you like, and I think that attracted Maurencio's attention, just as he was interested in the much earlier music, going back to the 15th century, actually, some of it. And things like Robert Wilkinson's 13-part canon, which is in the Eton Choir book, originally composed probably in the 1490s or very early 1500s, and he even goes so far as to more or less copy the illuminated J of Jesus in his copy. This is Baldwin's hand, but it's trying to imitate what the Eton Choir book looked like, going back nearly 100 years before his own time. So another person, like the Academy of Ancient Music, interested in keeping hold of old music. Okay, score format. Most of the music is written on pre-ruled staves and pre-organised, I'll call them bar lines because that's what they look like, but they're not bar lines in the modern sense of dividing the music up into equal rhythmic units. If you were to have a closer look at this, you'd find that some of these bars have 4 minims in, some have 6 some even have 8, depending on how busy the music was. They were just reference points. The point about the score is you may work from a set of part books. By writing it in score, you can actually see how it all fits together. So I think it's a study aid that Baldwin was wanting to see how the counterpoint worked from a visual point of view as well as an oral one. It works across the opening, so actually you've only got half the opening there. So the music starts on the upper 5 staves, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, and then moves across to here, and then you go back to there and read right across the bottom, which is slightly frustrating if you want to look at it on the Diane website, where it's done folio by folio by folio, so you're constantly scrolling backwards and forwards between pairs of folios to get the spread of it going across. There's misattribution here as well, or unusual things about it. This is a piece by Dr. Bull, John Bull, and he's given it a Latin title, Deus Omnipotens, which doesn't seem to survive in any other source. There's no text, but it is identical music to the piece we know as the Star Anthem. Almighty God by the leading of the star, the Christmas anthem by John Bull, the verse anthem. The music's absolutely, almost totally identical. So why did Baldwin not know that? Why did he not call it the Star Anthem? Why did he give it a spurious Latin title? Maybe it did have Latin words at some point. Baldwin was Catholic. Maybe he had an alternative text in mind. But it doesn't survive anywhere else. You can see here some of the quirks of Baldwin's writing. If you remember the diamond-shaped noteheads of the Neville book, that was his public hand, that was his open to the public. This is his private hand. It's much quicker, it's much more easy to do. There's a round notehead, slightly teardropped. The stems all slant very slightly to the left, as opposed to the very vertical ones in Neville. I suspect that this is his sort of private handwriting. This wasn't for public consumption, this was just for him, primarily. And so he writes in an informal hand. It's actually quite easy to read, but it is quite condensed on the stave. Because of the bar lines not being bar lines, if you see what I mean, he doesn't use ties across the bar lines, and this was often the case with anything that had vertical lines at this period. So a dotted note would have the note one side and the dot the other side. A semi-breve tied over, in modern terms, was just written as a semi-breve with the bar line going through the middle of it, and so on. These were conventions of using score format. You didn't need to know where the downbeat was because it didn't exist. The modern sense of the bar line implying a pulse doesn't work in this music. The line is simply for orientation. Occasionally he gets things wrong. He's already ruled I'll keep calling them bar lines just because it's easier to think of them like that. He's written those first, and then when it comes to fill in the music, he suddenly realises I've got a hell of a lot of notes to fit in this, and they get very condensed in some of these bars with lots of notes, whereas at the beginning he can be more spacious. And he even gets it wrong, and you may not be able to see, but there are some curved bar lines down here, where he's written into his second bar and then went, oops, I've made a mistake there. So rather than scratch it all out and rewrite it, he's just bent the bar line. So that your line coordinating the parts has to do a little kink. I think that's rather sweet. And he's done it so that this part's gone out of sync for quite a while. He has to keep going until he corrects it here. So in all the score format pieces, there's no text under there. The other interesting feature about Baldwin's Commonplace book, he includes this dreadful poem, which he's written, which I'm afraid I'm going to read bits to you. I think he should have had a job with rather cheap Christmas cards or birthday cards. It's absolute doggerel. And he begins to outline which composers he regards highly and why he's put them in his book. I will begin with White, Shepper, Tye and Tallis, Parsons, Giles, Mundy the Old, one of the Queen's palace, Mundy Young, the old man's son, and likewise others more. Their names would be too long, therefore I let them go. Yet must I speak of more, even of strangers also, strangers meaning foreigners. And first I must bring in Alfonso Ferrabosco. A stranger born he was in Italy, as I hear. It's like Rupert the Bear, isn't it? Do you remember Rupert the Bear? Italians say of him, in skill he had no peer. Luca Marenzio, and others many more, as Philippe de Monte, the emperor's man also, the the Holy Roman Emperor's composer Philip de Mont, and Orlando by name, Lassus, and Ec Trequillion. Hello. That's Crequion, Thomas Crequion, and he's bottled up the name and put the T as the beginning of Trequillion. Cipriano Rore, and also Andreon. Is that Adrian Willett? Who knows? We know who some of those composers were, we even have portraits of them. But, yet let not strangers brag, nor they these so commend, for they may now give place and set themselves behind an Englishman, by name William Byrd for his skill, who I should have set first, but so it was my will, whose great skill and knowledge doth excel all at this time, and far to strange countries abroad his skill doth shine. Did it? Was Byrd known in countries far away? There's not much evidence of that, I have to say, but maybe Baldwin was toadying to his composer friend. With fingers and with pen he hath not now his peer, for in this world so wide as none can him come near. The rarest man he is in music's worthy art that now on earth doth live. I speak it from my heart. Oh. So an encomium for William Byrd by his friend and copyist colleague John Baldwin. And for those who haven't seen it, that's the memorial plaque that was revealed in 23, the anniversary year, in Lincoln Cathedral, in the middle of the choir of Lincoln Cathedral, to the memory of William Byrd, who in this place steered the course of English sacred music. That's debatable. He got short shrift from the Dean and Chapter at Lincoln, who disapproved of his long organ improvisations and so on. He did not have a happy time at Lincoln and was quite grateful to come back to London, or to be in London at the Chapel Royal afterwards, but nevertheless, that's a rather nice memorial. In 1940, Boyd, in Elizabethan Music and Musical Criticism, said, "The above lines are poor poetry, but good criticism." Fair enough, he's picked out some of the most important foreign composers and William Byrd as the great composers. Now, again, the colour stones will show the first three are in green, which you can't see. But they're some of the earliest composers in either of these manuscripts. John Beddingham, who died in 1560, Robert Wilkinson, who wrote the 13-part canon, John Taverner, with 15 pieces. None of those three are mentioned in his awful poem. He only deals really with his contemporary composers in the poem, but he includes several pieces by these ancient composers who long dated by his time. There are some composers here that are in blue. The blue ones are the foreigners, they're the strangers. But there are ones in red, Willett, Crequion, de Rore, Lassus, all mentioned in the poem. Not a note by them in this manuscript. So did he know their music and just not bother to copy it, even though he said they're the greatest? Or was he just showing off in the poem, saying, I know about all these people, but I've never actually seen their music? Quite an interesting thought. Or did he not really think very much of their music and couldn't be bothered to copy it? The only one that does get copied largely is Maurizio, and there are 5 pieces by Ferrabosco the Elder. So the poem and the contents of the book don't quite add up, but this does give a good survey of music making in Elizabethan, particularly late Elizabethan England, with many of the main Chapel Royal and church composers, Parsons, White, Byrd, Mundy. Mundy the Younger, John Mundy, was organist at St George's, Windsor as well, so another close colleague of Baldwin's. And more modern composers, he doesn't mention in the poem, Mundy, Morley, Giles, and himself. Baldwin copies 20 of his own pieces into this. I mentioned Maurizio earlier, and I think this is quite a significant part of the collection, which doesn't represent anything like 31390. There was Italian music in that, but it was from the first half of the 16th century. This is really up-to-date music. The 13 madrigals by Maurizio that Baldwin copies come from collections published in the 1580s, one from the first book of madrigals in 5 voices, one from the second book, and the bulk of them, 11 of them, from a collection of madrigals in several different parts, 4, 5 and 6 voices, published in 1588. So he's pretty hot at having got hold of these quite quickly. Interestingly, he doesn't copy any of the pieces that were published in Musica Transalpina or Italian madrigals Englished. Those collections published in London in the 1580s and 1590s, where the Italian texts were removed and English poetry was substituted. He doesn't bother with any of those. Perhaps he already had the books himself, didn't need them. He was copying music that weren't in those collections. And again, as I said earlier, I think he's quite interested in some of the ways that Merencio writes. This is from O voi che sospirate, which we'll be playing tonight. And it's one of these pieces that has some really strange enharmonic notations. We were talking earlier about equal temperament or various mean tone temperaments. This is a piece that goes in the, you can't see it down here, but there's a bass part that goes through a cycle of fifths, down a fifth, up a fourth, down a fifth, up a fourth, and takes you from B flat to E flat to A flat to D flat to G flat, and the next move should be to C flat, which he writes enharmonically as a B natural. And above the A flat in the superior part is a G sharp. Now, if you're working in equal temperament, those are two different pitches. G sharp and A flat aren't the same thing. A flat's higher than you might expect, and G sharp's lower. But I'm sure a group of singers would have harmonised that and adjusted the chord so that it didn't sound grotesquely out of tune. With viols, depending on how you're fretted, most of us are fretted in slightly unequal temperaments these days, despite what was said earlier. We have to do some cunning adjustments of fingers on frets and things to try and ameliorate the A flat G sharp scrunch. But I think that's one of the reasons that Baldwin was interested in Merencio, was that he was pushing the boundaries of what was possible harmonically in the 1580s. He's not interested in the Italian, he doesn't copy the text. Only one of these 13 has a title, Dolorosi Martir, which does appear in the second volume of Musica Transalpina later on. But he's interested in the dots, he's interested in the music and what that can tell him about this new style of doing things quite differently from English contemporary composers. As with 31390, we have examples of misattribution. Now this may be because Baldwin didn't know the composer of the music he was copying, or he was copying from a source that had already got the composer wrong. Who knows? But there's a pair of motets here that purport to be by Ferrabosco the Elder. The first is Salve Me Domine, has its title up there in the top left-hand corner, and then goes from there to there, finishes there, and then there's what appears to be a secunda pars, Christe Redemptor. There's no liturgical place in which those two texts would come together as first and second parts in a motet. It may be that whoever, whether it was Baldwin himself or the person he was copying from, had heard this opening, rising, bom, 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 and related it to Salvanos, the chant, serum chant that begins with that same sort of pattern, and thought, oh, that must be a Salvano setting, and gave it a Salva Me title. But these two texts come from completely different services. One is from Compline, one's from a Christmas Vespers service. So they don't belong together. However, the same music, at least the bass part of it, crops up in one of the manuscripts copied for the Peter family. It's now in Chelmsford Record Office. It's just the bass part, the other parts are missing. And the music is identical to the bass part, and it sets a French chanson, Du Bon du Coeur, by Philip Van Wilder, who's represented elsewhere in this manuscript. So, did Ferrabosco know the Van Wilder and rather like the piece and say, I'll have that and pretend it's mine? Or did Baldwin get confused, or did someone else get confused? There's a number of different things. But if we look, you may or may not be able to see that. This is a modern edition of the chanson by Van Wilder, and that's the score copied according to Baldwin to be Ferrabosco. The top two parts are reversed. He does one or two bits of copying parts in a different order. There's one or two tiny changes, but more or less it's identical to what was published in 1546. Van Wilder was a as I said earlier, a very important composer, so I'm surprised that Baldwin didn't know that and didn't want to attribute it to him. But Baldwin doesn't seem to know about Van Wilder. He doesn't mention it in his poem, he doesn't copy his music otherwise, though it was very familiar from 31390. Maybe he was a bit out of date by the 1580s, and Baldwin wanted to update it by giving it to Ferrabosco. There's many reasons why a piece might get misattributed. But it's quite interesting. I don't think anyone spotted that connection before. People have written about this and said, well, these two parts don't seem to belong together. They're actually the first and second parts of the chanson. They do belong together in Van Wilder. The music belongs together, but the words don't. Another feature of the Baldwin Commonplace book is that it collects a lot of his own music. Many of which are dated from the 1590s into the 1600s. And again, he's quite interested in music that is complex in various ways. They're mostly small scale, 2-part pieces, lots of duos, 3-part pieces like the Browning, some English anthem settings, and this song, In the Merry Month of May, that I mentioned earlier, that may be the song that was sung for Elizabeth at Eltham. But he's interested in things like this, proportions to the minimum, upon a plain song, pieces where he's playing with the numerical mensuration proportions of 9 notes in the time of 4 and 16 in the time of 3 and all sorts of complicated relationships. Some of them so complex that I don't really think they're playable, and even if they were, they wouldn't be very interesting to listen to. They're I think, an intellectual exercise more than anything. And interestingly, many of these proportion pieces are written by 2 composers, Baldwin and his colleague Nathaniel Giles, as though they were trying to outdo each other with how complicated they could write music. Here's one I did yesterday. Oh, I can do better than that. A bit like the so-called contention between Ferrabosco and Bird about writing various versions over a plain song. Some of the music is well worth restoring and performing. Some of it less interesting, perhaps. Here's one of these proportion pieces. This is upon ut re mi fa, and this is in choir book format. It's no longer a score. This is one part that has all these different proportions. The mensuration signs keep changing, and he puts 9 in the time of 4, 9 in the time of 2, 5 in the time of 2, 15 in the time of 4. I mean, there's nothing as complicated as this until the mid-20th century, when people like Fernie Ho and so on are writing music so complicated that it's almost unplayable. And Fernie Ho said, that's the point. What I'm interested in is performer tension. He's interested in a piece that can't really be performed and what the performer does with that. I think that's a bit mean, but there you go. So this is music to tease you. And right at the bottom of the other folio is the ut re mi in slow notes. You don't really need to write that down because everyone knows ut re mi, but so part 1 takes up 2 pages of complicated stuff, and part 2 has an up and down to be repeated ad infinitum until the other bloke's finished. Finis, John Baldwin, signed off at the bottom. There are 2 pieces relating to the in nomine, which takes us back to 31390 and all those in nomines. There's a 5-part in nomine, which is fairly conventional in that the in nomine part starts on D and sits in the second voice. What's unusual about it is that the superiors part and the tenor part are in canon. So he's made life more complicated for himself as a contrapuntist. He's not only writing 4 parts around the in nomine, but he's writing 2 of those parts that work in strict canon throughout. Baldwin was a crossword puzzler, wasn't he? He was the sort of person that enjoyed setting himself a challenge and seeing what he could do with it. So that's the in nomine in 5 parts, dated 1606. That one is the piece that we're going to play tonight, called Upon in nomine, and I think the title's significant because it's not an in nomine, it's upon in nomine. It's more of a fantasy using the in nomine theme. The in nomine part is here, and as you can probably see, it starts off in breves and ends up in semi-breves. Halfway through, or more or less halfway through, Baldwin starts making it move faster, so the harmony can change more frequently. But the other 3 parts are really quite complicated, full of syncopations and groups of 3s plus 2s to make 5s and so on. It's one of the more complicated pieces to put together. And then he says on the treble part, the triplex part, C placitus. You can see that slightly more closely there. Upon denominator 4 voce, the page has been cut, so you miss some of it. It is triplex C placitus. In other words, the top part is an additional extra. You can have it if you like, but it works in 3 parts without. And tonight we're going to do it 2 times, one with 3 parts and then with the 4th part added. But this is very typical of Baldwin's own music, his complex thinking. He doesn't want to do anything very straightforward. It's always got a twist to it. So to sum up Baldwin's book, he says it himself in another little bit of doggerel. This is a storehouse of treasure, this book may be said, of songs most excellent, the best that is made. It was his pick of the bunch, his Desert Island Discs, his collection of pieces that he thought were good and were worth preserving. And interestingly, worth preserving from nearly 100 years ago. Really, some of this music is very old, and some of it's quite new. Wide-ranging. Kerry McCarthy in her Tallis book sums this up rather nicely. I couldn't do better than this. He copied more than 400 pieces of music overall. He had a special liking for old, obscure, complex, and politically unfashionable pieces, i.e. Catholic, Roman Catholic texted motets. Much of his energy as a copyist was spent on what his own generation would have considered early music. As a result, he rescued important works, especially Latin texted works, from oblivion or near oblivion. Without Baldwin's copies, both the part books and the Commonplace book, a lot of that pre-Reformation music wouldn't have survived. Other copies were destroyed or parts were missing. Particularly the scorebook, because you've got all the parts on one page, you're less likely to lose a bit than you are from a set of part books. It's not known that Baldwin was a Catholic himself. In fact, he would have had to have sworn the oath of allegiance to Elizabeth on becoming a member of the Chapel Royal, though that didn't seem to stop Bird. I think it's just music he really wanted to preserve. So as with 31390, it's a collection largely of old music. Some of these pieces have little historical annotations, things about the composer, not as much as the Dow books, which are full of little Latin tags about the composers, which are more interesting. So, what do these two books have in common? What questions do they raise for us? So I said, they both collect music from the beginning of the 16th century, mostly without a text. Is this viol music? Well, it certainly could be viol music. It could be sung without its text, it could be solfege. But what did all these Elizabethan consorts play before Holborn published his Dances of 1599? They must have played something. They clearly played vocal music. Dow's book has vocal music interspersed with instrumental music. These two don't have any text, but they could have been sung, but I think they're quite likely music that would have been played by consorts of instruments, as the rather later title page tells us. It was music thought worthy of preserving. And for those of us that look back over several hundred years, that's worth knowing. What music was thought special at that time? Because it may not be what we think is special now. It could be quite different. They collect pieces from different genres, side by side. Latin motets, French chansons, in nomines, jostling, not in no particular order. When we do modern programmes of viol music, we tend to play fantasy after fantasy after fantasy, or we better put a pattern in, fantasy, fantasy, fantasy. That's not what they did, not in the Elizabethan period, maybe they did in the Jacobean period, but they're much more interested in this mix of different sorts of genre. Should we be, as players today, be exploring more widely the French chanson repertory, the early Italian madrigal repertory, motets without their words? Many of us do and enjoy it. Many viol players, I mean, Josie and I play with a group in York, and they say, "Oh, you've brought some greens along. We have to eat our greens before we can play the real music." So we do 2 or 3 pieces of this sort of repertory. Right, can we get the Jenkins and Laws out now? How many consorts are like that? I wonder. I suspect more than you'd probably want to let us know. Yes, Laws and Jenkins have their many virtues, but so does this much earlier music. And I think for many of us, the exploration of early counterpoint and how the relationship between the parts works is fascinating. Many of the composers in both these volumes we would now consider to be minor composers. Yes, the birds are there, yes, Tallis is there. How much Van Wilder do you play regularly? Probably not a lot, but he was very highly regarded in his own lifetime and by these collectors, and so on. And I think perhaps we should make it a bit of a voyage of exploration for us as 21st century viol players to explore this earlier repertory more than we do. You'd be surprised at what's there, full of variety, full of difficulties if you start playing Baldwin's music. Even Ty's music, Ty's in Nominees in 31390, many of those have fairly complex relationships of triplets against duplets and so on, which are fascinating. One point I forgot to mention about 31390, which is just worth dropping in here before I completely forget it. I've read one reference in secondary literature to Woodcock being a chorister at Ely when Ty was Master of Music at Ely. I haven't seen the original, and I don't know whether that's right, whether, I need to follow that up. But if Woodcock knew Ty at Ely, and then was involved with anything to do with the 31390, which collects much of Ty's music that's not known anywhere else, is that another piece of evidence of Woodcock being heavily involved? Anyway, that's something to follow up. But I think if we can take anything away from this afternoon, it's to have a go at playing music that we don't often play. Not all of it is available in modern editions. You may need to go back to the Diane website and transcribe for yourself some of these manuscripts. A lot of the madrigal and chanson repertory is available on IMSLP and CPTL and so on, but because it's chanson and madrigals, viol players tend to ignore it and say, well, it's not instrumental music. Well, yes, it is. It could be, as these manuscripts show. So, go forth and explore is my motto. Thank you very much.